And I'm going to play a short countdown and then we'll be on. So, hello to everyone out there. I hope that you can hear my guests when they speak. YouTube, you'll be able to see the guests, and Facebook, you'll be able to see them as well. All right. So, welcome everyone. We had a little bit of an issue last week, but we on top of it this week. Victoria Leonard is coming to us from the United Kingdom. Gina Medico is coming to us from the United States, and I am coming to you from the United States as well. I'm in Lexington, Kentucky, and Victoria is not familiar with my format. So I know that tonight we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of our own personal stories, because Lord knows we all got one. And we all know that with a narcissist, there is no short story. And there's no story that doesn't leave any stone unturned, because it is crazy making for sure. But I always start with the same question. And then I allow the conversation to grow organically, like we're sitting truly having a cup of coffee. And so, hey, Gina, what are you drinking?
My Diet Coke.
Oh, Diet Coke. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Diet Cokeaholic. I admit it.
So my first question is, and it's a doozy. So answer it as much as you can and as safely as you can. Tell us who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us where you've been briefly, and tell us where you're going. What are some of your goals? And then we'll go to Gina, and then we will begin our conversation. So, welcome.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm Victoria Leonard. I'm a mother. I'm a warrior. I have been on a journey that I thought, I suppose, at the age of 37 years old, I'd kind of seen most of it. And I realise now that I'm a speck of dust floating in the universe. And my goal is to try as hard as I can to understand all the nasties as much as I can for children who are going through what I see as this narcissistic system, the narcissistic abuse, and trying to make the system a better place for those children, and mainly selfishly my 3 girls. So yeah, that's hopefully where I'm going. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Well, because I know that your own story includes your own children and the difficulty of having navigated this system in that respect. So do you want to give us a little bit of something?
Yeah, sure. So I only came on this journey because I think, like most parents, when you are gifted with the joy of becoming a mother, you kind of go through this haze, rose tinted glasses, everything's going to be fine. You're going to live the fairy tale that is portrayed to you in Disney. And like you were saying about the narcissist and the flags, and you don't see it until afterwards. It's the same, sadly, not just in relationships, but it can also be the same with experiences when it comes to support, midwives, health visitors, doctors, pediatricians, and how you feel as a female. And I have to be specific because this is my journey that I've been on, how you can feel gaslit. And I've been fortunate enough to have 3 daughters, and I don't really want that cycle evolving anymore. I want to break that chain. And hopefully by people like us talking openly about narcissism, how it's on the increase, how, people now say you're either a narcissist or an empath, how that really has impacted my life, where I've sat back and gone, at 37 years old, I'm realizing the world is not a beautiful place. It's not safe to bring children into. 50% of people that they're going to meet are going to turn out to be sociopaths, psychopaths, which are all people with narcissistic tendencies. How am I going to safeguard them? And the more, it's like that rabbit hole you said, the more you go into it, and the more you realize that it's commonplace in solicitors' law firms, in social work placements, in foster care placements, in holistic therapy, in the healthcare providers. And then I've reached out further, like to people in America that are suffering the same things, parental alienation, all these different offsets, which are narcissistic abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like this cyclone where it just picks up a different face or a different trend, the police. Right. And and that's kind of, it's been soul destroying, but at the same time it's made me reach out because I felt so alone, and find people like you and other survivors, and actually look at how strong, like you said, you look back and you go, wow, what did I come through? It was a jungle, but at the time you were just running, so you weren't really seeing much.
Right.
And and then you sit back and you listen to other people's stories and you realize this is the pandemic. This is the fight of truth. This is, persistent litigation, using the services against people. And it's often the saddest part for me. It's the vulnerable people in society that rely on the services that then get removed from them. And it's the people that should really benefit from them that are then scared, such as myself, of all the people that I should reach out to: doctors, social workers.
Right.
I see the police and I shake, because I think, what's coming now? What other form of abuse am I going to get?
Well, and I know, Victoria, when I started counseling, because right after my relationship, I really thought that maybe the issue was me, that somehow I didn't see something or know something. And you go into the office, and I know that here in America, we relinquish to authority as though they are the be all end all know all. And so I walked in there, and immediately the questions they ask, when you're so fresh out of abuse, everything seems like it was your fault. And you've been told it was your fault by the narcissist. So, so I ended up going in and immediately asked questions like, well, what could you have done differently? It's like, what? What do you mean, what could I have done differently? I didn't know there was something going on. Like, I didn't know there was something sinister. So you're right. These people are not, and I don't want to take away from anyone's degree, but they're not trauma informed. They're not narcissistic knowledgeable, because the narcissist and anyone with narcissistic personality disorder in particular, I know that perhaps we all have narcissistic tendencies or traits or characteristics. That's part of our self-preservation. But when there is that level of manipulation and gaslighting to what they're doing, I know that in my situation, the individual more than proved who he was after the fact, because when he lost control, he lost it through narcissistic injury and or rage. And when he figured out that he couldn't regain control, then, as you said, he uses the system. Well, then where does that leave me to use the system? Because if they're going to buy into him, then where does that leave me to go get support? And at what level do I trust him? It's like, you actually took his complaint? Did you read it? Like, did you, So I'm going to stop there for a moment. Gina, good or bad, right or wrong, real or imagined, my friend Gina. So tell us who you are, where you've been, where you're going, and please tell us what you want us to know and what you feel safe sharing. And then we'll delve into how the system continues to perpetuate victims as victims of the system itself. So, Gina?
Well, good evening. My name is Gina Medico, and I'm a mother, a certified paralegal, along with, I also am an advocate for women who have experienced the system, either through child custody matters or being arrested for domestic violence, wrongfully arrested. I mostly try to help women fight for their rights on their own behalf. Most often they're women who cannot afford an attorney, or they may have had an attorney, but the attorney doesn't seem to be fighting on their behalf or presenting their best selves for the courts. So I really do try to help women. I've been more helping women on an individual basis in the last couple of years, as opposed to, being more open. I do have my nonprofit, Sweet Corner Girl, which I started 2 years ago to assist women and to empower women that they have the voice to stand up for themselves in court. I started in the legal field back when I was 20. I wanted to be a lawyer. I started as working in a law office, and my interest was not at all litigation or anything that had to do with family law. My interest was corporate law. My interest was residential real estate, commercial law, business law. It was not anything to do with emotions, because I had experienced the court system, but as a child, I was not involved in it. I was a child of a parent who abandoned me, and I was a child of a mother who experienced domestic violence also, that I was not fully aware of or understood throughout my childhood and my young adult life. So I became involved. Basically, Victoria, I was thrust into it, and you do become thrust into it. We do walk around with blinders. We always believe that someone else is taking care of us, because we've been lulled into this belief that, the government's going to take care of us. We have these laws that are great. They're going to do the right thing. They're always going to, they're going to know the truth. We're in the judicial system. They're going to let us present both sides. But sadly, I have learned, as I, recently got my degree, because I had spent a great amount of my adult life, my young adult life, protecting myself or fighting the system, either protecting myself from the system or fighting the system, just to be able to see and hold my children, just for that right to be a parent, to be a mother. That I just felt, like it was so elusive to me, and it was the only thing that I really wanted. I think that when we find ourselves in abusive situations or narcissistic, situations, they know what your weakest point is. They know what is the most important thing, and so they are going to play that. And unfortunately, we are in a system that has, if you think about it, when I first when I was a child, there were no women judges. So we are coming out of. They were coming out of that time period where women were starting to become involved in as attorneys, as judges, as law enforcement. That was unheard of, 40, 50 years ago. That was not the norm.
But Gina,
yes.
But then I have to ask, has it really helped?
No, and that's what was my next point, Tina. I was going to say that. They do not help. There is a good boy. They want to fit in. And you have two, they want the men to like them. So they go along with this bias that's been ingrained in our judicial system and our system, since the beginning of time. I mean, if we think back, women had no rights. Children had no rights. We were property. And our judicial system and the people that seem to be running it forgot that part of history.
Well, and which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Right.
We are groomed also by our gender bias, and we're groomed to be a certain role as women. And so even when you try to step out of that role, it's extremely difficult to step outside that role, because no one sees you outside that role. You barely see yourself outside that role.
Correct. People don't realize that it wasn't until 1964 that the first law was put into place where a woman can leave a marriage with property that she received from her own family.
The year I was born.
64.
In the UK, it was only in 1991 that it was seen as rape if a husband sexually assaulted a
And
wife.
ours were similar. I think it was 1994. I think, I can't recall.
So, and that's, when I think about that, I think how scary.
But
And it was only 125 years ago we got the vote.
exactly. And the women
not that
still
long
couldn't
ago.
get a mortgage in 1964 unless her husband signed for it, or her father, or her brother. Those are the things. Or credit card. A woman could not get a credit card. There's a part of me that's really hard on older women, and I try not to be, because I have to recall that part of it. They were only allowed to be secretaries, teachers, nurses. They were very limited into the job prospects, that we and our children enjoy now. And I have to remember that, because they are still coming out of that society, and the ingrained and the bias that they grew up with, which was
But then
even
they
worse
had
than
more
what we have.
freedom. They had more freedom, I feel, in some ways, because they didn't get this whole picture perfect, filter lifestyle that our children, I'm terrified of them, and they can't play in the street, and it seems that
but then you
these
look at the United States. I mean, we just came out of one of the craziest election cycles.
Yeah.
And the individual who was elected, regardless of what you thought he might do politically, on a personal level, he made such derogatory comments about women, and yet women voted for him in large numbers. And it's like, I couldn't reconcile that, but obviously a lot of women did. And it makes no sense to me that they could reconcile someone saying the things that he said prior to his election.
But do you think it's interesting you should say this, because we have this new woke agenda now, where I feel as a woman, like I've had conversations where someone's tried to say to me that I'm a cis woman. And I'm like, listen, I don't want to label myself. I'm Victoria Leonard, I'm not offended by what people call me, generally. But I feel offended that you're labeling me. If you want to label yourself as a broccoli or a roller coaster, that's up to you. But I don't want to label anybody or put stick-it notes on anybody. And I feel that, you're mentioning about your president making derogatory comments about women. We're having the same thing over in the UK, where women are being treated like vessels. We've got this new thing like birth mother, and like we as the feminine are being taken away, like we are regressing back to 50-60 years ago, where
I believe so too.
Yeah, I think I dress as a handmaid quite annoyingly to most people and turn up at protests just silently sometimes. And a few of us have started doing it, and we call it May Day, just because I feel that is actually all I am in society. I'm not protected. I can be beaten, call 999. If it's a man that did it, the chances are he's going to get away with it, or I'll get arrested for aggravating him with something slanderous I said to him. Do you know what I mean? It's yeah.
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, a lot of the law enforcement, judges, attorneys are facilitators of domestic violence. They, one of the things that I find is that there'll be an accusation on her part, even though she may have had 6 reports of domestic violence prior. He'll do something, then they do nothing. They do nothing to him, and then she will strike back. And then they'll immediately arrest her, and they will put her through the system. And I had a young woman, she threw, in the middle of an argument, she threw a stuffed animal, and she was prosecuted to the fullest extent. A stuffed animal. And when we do this in our society, we lessen the severity of domestic violence.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes it not, when we prosecute those things, because on the other hand, we prosecute a woman who's thrown a stuffed animal, but then, we give the option for a man who put his wife in the hospital, batterers intervention programs, and, deferred probation, but, as long as he goes through a batterer's class, which these classes are just not sufficient.
Can I ask you a question, Gina? Because actually I'm
Sure.
fascinated if it's the same in America. But over here, they say that the man that committed domestic abuse, so even say, for an example that we've had recently at Family Superheroes, is a man beat his wife to the point where she was in hospital. So her children were removed because he fled the scene by the police and taken into care.
Mhm.
When she was still in her coma, they gave the children to the father
Right.
because they said that the father, he may have perpetrated domestic abuse against the mother, but she wasn't safeguarding, allowing herself to be the victim because he was
Yes.
looking after the kids.
And that is what the new twist has been on all of our laws, which
Yeah,
there's a
it's the
Grayson's
same
law
then.
that was passed not too long ago. Grayson's law, and it was for the memory of a child who was killed by his father. His father committed suicide, killed the child, committed suicide, and after the mother begged for the child, for him to not have the child, the courts ignored her. And so what they have done now is they've added to the laws. One of the things that I don't do anymore is I don't support these laws for coercive control or anything, because by the end of the time it's gone through committee and House and all the, tacking on other bills, you get things that really don't represent what it started to look like to begin with.
Yeah, it's
And
a piecemeal.
this is so egregious. There was a time when I was with one of the domestic violence places in our community here, and this young woman would come in, and she just had a baby, and she was beside herself because the baby was immediately taken from her because she went back to her abuser. Now, he had gone through his course, his courses. He had gone through his courses. This was prior to Jennifer's law being passed. And they were making her go through so many hoops to see her child, to be with her child, to care for her child. And it was all because she was going back to her abuser, because he was the breadwinner. She did not have any means to care for her or her child. But, and this is what the problem has been. And there are some changes that are being made. I'm not sure how in depth they've gone, because I haven't looked into it lately. But they're not they're not helping women to become self-sufficient. They're not.
The police, they're not going to go to the police if the police have already arrested them twice and blamed them and then took their child away from them. And
well, and I was going to say, we also have this notion of everything is black and white. Okay, so everything is there's this line, and I've heard people say, well, he may be an abuser, but he's a great dad. And it's like, how can you be a great dad if you're an asshole and an abuser to the mother of the children? It's like, how can you separate those two ideas? It's like, that is the same individual.
Well, that's important that you say that, Tina, because if you go to some of the websites, and there's one in particular I could think of right now that I just recently had some experience with, but if you go to their websites, it says right in their domestic violence website, the abuser can get your child, because it doesn't matter about that. They don't want to hear about abuse. They still don't want to hear about abuse. They don't care what he's done to you.
It's a he said, she said. That's right, what you want to treat it as.
It's based on the best interest of the child. And a lot of times what happens is one parent ends up getting sole custody, and it's usually the abusive parent that gets the primary residential, and they're very controlling, and they limit the amount of time that they see the other parent, the parent that's usually the more loving and giving and nurturing of that child, where the other one is abusive. They carry on the abuse, because we all know that narcissists or abusers, they need a host. They need something to feed off. So it turns into directed towards the child.
Right.
And it happens quite often, and it happens too often.
Let me
Mm.
stop
And
for just a moment. I want to welcome again everyone on who's on TikTok. I know that you may not be able to see the guests, but I hope that you can hear. You've tuned in to a podcast called Love Over Coffee, Voices Not Heard. This is for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. And tonight, my guests are Victoria Leonard, and she is in the United Kingdom, and Gina Medico, who is here in the United States. And we're talking about not only the abuse of individuals, but the systemic abuse from the system toward victims, and how they don't really hear us or see us. And the perpetrator has learned to manipulate the system, and the system in itself has a history of not seeing or hearing victims. I mean, you think about even our bail system here in the United States. You have a you're basically kept, you're arrested as though you are guilty first. Even though we say innocent until proven guilty, you're arrested first, and then you have to prove your way out. But often, while you're trying to prove your way out, you're guilty of poverty because you can't afford an attorney and you can't afford the bond to get yourself out. So, therefore, you sit inside and you're unable to fight easily from behind bars.
right,
And somehow the perpetrator is on the outside doing all the work they can to file all the papers they can while
hmm
you're in a status of not being able to do anything. So
right.
that's where we are. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. Sorry.
It's really interesting, Tina. You say that. One of the things that I've been hearing a lot lately, which kind of makes me laugh because it's just it's like we're led to believe statistics and you know how things were and how things are today that just were not true. you know they're saying that more women are being arrested, and well, that may be true. They used to handle it that she was property, and it was handled through the family, it was handled through the churches and what have you. And if they felt that she needed a beating in her family, they gave her one, and that was how that was handled. And so these crimes or whatever that are committed, um, it's not so much that there's more crimes, it's just that
Right.
we now have mass media that we did not have before.
Mm.
The laws were such that you could be put in jail, and believe it or not, Charles Dickens is the one who's kind of got me excited about the jail system, because his father was in jail. His father was imprisoned while he was a youth, and
Mm.
that really affected him, and it propelled his writing. And he wrote about how horrible the jail system was back then. Uh,
And
and
sadly, it has not improved.
no, it hasn't. It really hasn't, and that's what's so scary about it. I just read recently that a man was killed because for 1,000 bites of bed bugs. I mean, come on. The one thing is, our judicial system, the people who are in charge of our jails, they really do need to look at themselves as not the punisher. They are not the punisher. They are
Right.
just absolutely carrying out uh, what the state has imposed upon them, and they should not be inflicting a deeper sense of pain or punishment to our inmates. It certainly is not humane, first of all, but secondly, it's a reflection of why are you in that system yourselves? I mean,
There
Mm.
you're
was a
you're
study.
wanting to have some sort of power over somebody, because you can't have it in the outside world.
In
And
in this in the states.
when we make that distinction, that we have, it's like when you have a child and you have a punishment for that child, you should say what the punishment is, and you should stick to that punishment, but you shouldn't be punishing them for everything that goes on. If you have a child
Once
and
they've
you
been
say, okay,
rehabilitated.
you're not going to be able to go to your friend's house during this 2-week period. But you shouldn't be punishing that child for family events either. You shouldn't be saying, okay, well, you can't sit at the table either.
Right.
One of the things that, there's been long held research on children and punishment is that children who are punished, they actually need to be, that is the time that they need to be integrated into society more, as opposed to locking them and separating them and ostracizing them and labeling them, because that is usually what happens. And this goes back to when children were property, and in the 1900s,
Children should be
late
seen and
1800s.
not heard.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm gonna add too, and I'll try to make this quick, and I'll stop talking for a while. But one of the things that is known and has been published with the National Institute of Justice. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. I'm getting my citations confused because I've done a lot of reading recently. But children have been the most victimized in our society. That is the one thing that I'd like to say, is because and one of the things that they're finding, that the reason why a lot of these children, they do end up becoming what they call delinquent children, is because their abuse was never dealt with. And I'm talking about their perpetrator was never brought to justice. The child never was given their day in courts to say. And a lot of children, they're like, that's just life, suck it up. And it could go, like you say, Victoria, that 30% of those children, because I'm part of that 70%, I believe, of the children, of the people who've grown up and who've not, gone on to abuse or to perpetrate, but there is that 30% who do, and they've done research and studies on it, and you're on point. It's 30% of people who come from an abusive family or neglect or abandonment. Only 30%, and that's the 30% that we really need to embrace, so that we can put an end to this. Being the country with the most incarcerated youth.
Well, and you think about that 30%, not only are they impacted within the relationship of a marriage and or some sort of relationship. Correct. Maybe it's with a mom or a dad who's narcissistic. Perhaps both are. Perhaps it's a grandmother, a sibling. But you think about, because of the systemic abuse, it isn't just within the judicial system. You think about the educational system and how it perpetuates victimhood. And then you've got, the political system and the social system. It is permeated throughout all systems. And so while we are talking about the judicial system and perhaps, what goes on between a married couple and then the custody or high conflict profile or high conflict divorce, it is around the gamut of systems. And, if we think about narcissism and empath, we've all grown up in the same systems, good or bad, and right or wrong, real or imagined, right? And so with that being said, if narcissists and empaths come from the same place, trauma, and if the narcissist is acting out because they've been neglected or whatever, and the empath is acting out in such a way because they want to please people, where is the middle ground? How will we undo? And that's where I find both of you fascinating. And I'm going to add myself to the group as well, because we have all come up with something that we want to try to change the system.
Tackle it head on.
But how in the world do you change the system? Because I think about, police brutality here in the United States. You know, Black, Indigenous, people of color want to change the system, and yet you have to work within the system to change the system, and the system is already screwed up. So how do you fix it?
Mm.
And how do you not just fix it, but educate the masses of individuals that are still from the time period when things were different? Like, I mean, racism here is impossible to sometimes get across to some individuals because they went through the 60s and we lived through all of this and we changed everything. And I don't know what they're still complaining about. And it's like, wait a minute. If you're that individual, as Victoria pointed out, if someone is whoever they are and that's who they are, then and that's their truth, why are you trying to question it or change it or manipulate it in some way for them to see it the way you see it? And so we do that all the time. We just dismiss people and we dismiss what they feel or what they think or do or believe, and that somehow you know they should think and do and feel and believe what we do. And of course, that's not right. So you, Victoria, I think, have started a nonprofit, the Family Support.
Yeah. So I became Family Superheroes CIC. So we're hopefully going to become a charity. It's had a fair share of narcissistic attack because of what we do. And I've kind of realized that I'm quite good at taking problems, looking at them logically, and then throwing back answers. And I've kind of been quite free and loose with my answers, and I've given them to lobbyist groups. I've given them to government. I don't mind about copyright. You can have my ideas as long as you implement them, look at them and see them. And it's so interesting. Gina mentioned, I've written a few notes down about statistics. So in the UK, we found out through Family Superheroes, we did massive SARS requests, which is freedom of information collection groups. And because I was working with large groups of people, so we were getting sample sections of 1,000 people to fill in these surveys for us, I was finding the National Centre of Statistics, which is overseen by the UK government, was actually massively out in terms of statistics, but set in line with their government policy and agenda on certain things. So like you were saying about the narcissistic system feeding itself. And we have at the moment, which I know that in America they're having the same problem with, this RSE, educational sex education, which again, going back to gender and about fairness and equality. I know in America it's a problem, but in the UK at the moment, we have men who are very much men saying that they're transitioning to women, but they have male genitalia. They're rapists. They're in prison for that, being transferred to female prisons, raping women and making them become pregnant. So you talk about safe spaces, but there is very little violence in female prisons within the UK. That's a fact. And it's only started being, rapes.
Same with the United States.
Yeah, it's got really bad in the United States. Yeah. I've heard a few other people talking, across the seas about the same issue. And it's funny how everyone in their own country, I've spoken to people in New Zealand, Australia, this is a global issue. In 2011, the United Nations asked Israel to write the globalized sexual agenda. And they all began the media machine, which is, BlackRock and Vanguard, the World Health Organization, and all the powers that be that run us all. It's not just America. It's not just Europe. It runs every single country in the whole wide world. And they started in Guatemala, and they started running this sexual RSE education. Now, apparently, it's to teach consent, which is ironic because you don't teach consent. You either consent or you don't. And it's to teach about all these different cupcake genders. It's to teach about, the fact that you might have gender dysphoria, which is ironic because as a child growing up, you don't really and shouldn't really be thinking about sex because it's ahead of your time because you're a child only for a short pace of time. And in the UK, and I know it's happening with the drag queen story hour as well over there, we are being rammed with this skewed idea of gender, of females, of what's right and what's wrong. And just like that narcissistic idea, we are constantly being gaslit when we have a very strong opinion on something. Some people, believe in religion. Some people don't, but they still can believe I'm a woman. That's a man. I made a child with the man and the woman. That's how it happened. And there are times when the media, everything, all my influences sometimes make me feel like a bad person for wanting to stand up for myself as a female, for wanting to stand up for other females, saying, why are we letting the, oh, but they've got equal rights because they've got body dysmorphia, gender dysmorphia, you know, it's a real mental health illness. And then I'm going, hold on, you've admitted it's a mental health illness, yet you're allowing it to be influencing our children in education, to allow it to create laws to protect these people that are raping, and at the same time diminishing the responsibility of women as being
But this is
powerful.
where we get into that again, that argument of divide and conquer. If we can get people on opposite sides of whatever issue it is, it doesn't matter what the issue is today, issue A, issue C, issue Z, it doesn't matter. Whatever issue it is, if you can bipolarize the individuals, then they'll spend more time arguing against themselves than they will fixing anything, because it's a distraction, basically.
I think it's the new gender divide.
Well, you know, I do agree that we should have education. I think education is the ticket to anywhere. And I do believe that we should be educating our children about consent, because they don't know. And one of the things that was really alarming to me when my children were in school was the fact that children were being arrested for kissing another person, you know, without their consent. You know, the child was just so excited and ran up and kissed a girl, and it was
What, in school?
The school was the one that was upset, and how dare this child, which to me is traumatizing that child. But, you know, one of the things is that we do have laws of consent. So a child of 15 does not have consent,
Right.
but a child of 16 does. And the thing is that you'll have 15, 16, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds in the same high school, in the same social groups. And I had to tell my children, my daughter too, you are 16. Your friend is not.
Right.
I don't care how much they throw themselves at you. You tell them, I'm sorry. You do not consent to anything, because they are not of the legal age to consent. So we do need to educate our children, because our children are being put in harm's way because of
You see, we have the opposite happening over here.
And these children
we have kids that are really young being taught, like it now, it started in our schools at the age of 3, the RSE, so they're being taught about sex. So instead of what you're talking about, which I think is a really good idea, like the Pantysaurus thing, like control and laws, and like this is the thing, that would be brilliant, because that's helping them protect themselves.
Exactly.
It's the complete opposite of what is happening over here, where they're kind of liberalizing sex, like it's okay, you can put yourself on birth control, and sex is meant to be really good, and like the whole, you know, we don't want kids having bad sex, and it's like, well, shouldn't we be protecting them? And the idea that now in the UK we've got this idea that it's come from the Kinsey report, that children are sexual beings from birth, and because of that, children have sexual rights, which means children under the age of 16, because you just mentioned 16, even as long as they're Gillick competent, they can choose whether or not they consented. So if they had sex with an adult, male or female, and I would see that as grooming, and that person abusing a position of power because that's a child. In the UK, if the child says, oh no, I consented, which is like, for me, that's like Stockholm syndrome twisting it, then it's okay.
Well, you know, one of the biggest problems with children of sexual abuse, and I learned a lot about this when I was assisting young women who were abused in DCF custody, who were minors, and they were sexually abused by their foster parent. And one of the things what my role was, because they were being prosecuted, and they were also being the services in the community were being civilly, they had a civil lawsuit against them. And so unfortunately you have to give details of what you experienced. And one of the most difficult things for me to do was to assure these young women that the fact that they consented at times because they were in fear for their lives. was not consent technically. It really was not consent, just because you went along because you were in fear of your life, or in fear of being put in a lot of these children are being told that if they don't recant their stories, by caseworkers, if they don't recant their story of abuse, they're going to be put into like a group home, or into the juvenile
You'll be
justice
removed
system.
from your family.
Exactly. Or from the foster care home setting type, and they'll put them in more of a juvenile justice type of stuff.
Blame the victim.
That's one of the reasons why I became an advocate, is because who's watching these people? Who really is there's very few attorneys that do go after DCF. There is one that I know of down in the South. He had the majority of the cases throughout Florida. And nobody really wants to be the watchdog of these institutions that are turning these children out. And one of the things, and I want to make this a point, that when a child comes from neglect or abuse or abandonment, that child at that moment becomes more of a victim throughout their life. And we know this, but we still don't seem to reinforce support for that child. What we end up doing, and I was in a seminar in Florida about children in foster care, and all of these children were medicated, and they were diagnosed with some sort of a mental illness. There was no PTSD. It was mental illness. It was some sort of schizophrenia. It was bipolar. At 7, 8, 9 years old, they're being heavily medicated. And I don't know, research has shown that just really, should not be, because they're giving these children a lifetime. It's worse than having a criminal record.
Well,
and what they're doing is they're setting these children up to be victimized more, because people do look upon them,
the label
in society. They are labeled in society. It's heavily researched. I've written about it. It is heavily researched, and they are labeled throughout their life, and they become more victimized, a lot of times, because they end up giving up of feeling about themselves in a better way, because they're being told they're not, they have a mental illness. It never becomes about being a human. It becomes about, well, you've got this mental illness, so we need to treat that. We're not going to treat you as a human being. We're going to treat you as
even the educational system. I mean, my background is I'm a teacher, and so educationally, we understand that children are naturally, there is a range at which children learn to do certain things. And if you diagnose them too early, you take away the opportunity for them to develop it within the range. So even educationally, we look at, up until the child is 9 years old, we don't label them with anything as far as learning disability, dyslexia. We don't look at any of that stuff. We just simply say they are developmentally delayed. For whatever reason, they were not exposed. Right. And we allow nature and exposure to possibly solve the issue without unnecessarily diagnosing and or labeling a child.
Oppositional defiant disorder.
But yet we do it all the time, mental health wise. We diagnose children all the time with issues of mental health because something in their life is off, and it's like,
and they're acting normally for somebody. They're experiencing something that is so abnormal that any of us would react the same way. And instead of recognizing that and recognizing it in themselves, it's like they lack insight, they lack foresight, they lack having any kind of direction within themselves to see that what this child went through was extraordinary.
The system wants to see the line. It's like Did you steal the bread because you were hungry, or did you steal the bread to resell it and get money, or did you steal the bread because you just wanted to steal the bread?
Or
It's
you
like,
didn't, did you steal the bread because you didn't like the bread owner? You
right?
said
Yeah.
this,
So
you
look
know?
at me,
Are you
right?
malicious?
Yeah, exactly.
Calculated.
We just look. I mean, I remember, um, what was that show? Just the facts, ma'am. Well, that's fine,
Right,
except
right.
there's a lot of things that there's those areas of gray.
There is, well, adverse childhood effects. I say this all the
Well,
time. And if
that's
anyone's watching this, there's a free course you can do. It's only 90 minutes. Any parent can do it. And it's acesonlinetraining.org. And if you've suffered any adverse childhood effects,
Right,
if you've suffered from trauma, if you're watching this and you're going through trauma, it can be quite triggering to do it because there's like a little animation,
yes,
but it's so good because it will help you reflect on yourself and also stop those cycles for children. Like, because we don't even know we're doing it sometimes. Protective
right,
parenting,
right.
it's so funny. There's a fine line because you're protecting from the perpetrator of this abuse against you, but sometimes you can be stilting the relationship.
Mhm.
Is your constant accusations at someone that perhaps that comes from your childhood abuse and trauma and seeing domestic abuse, that's the way that you perceive love and a relationship to be? Have you dealt with that? These are all questions, obviously, that we go on this crazy journey of, am I being gaslit, am I not being gaslit? But
Mhm.
once you actually sit down and do that 90-minute course, it really just it sits home, and it can revert you back. It did me to my childhood a bit, listening to shouting through closed walls. How has that made me, sadly, then be okay and subservient to abuse? And it
Right.
has. Most of us don't want to admit our mistakes. It's taken me a long time. Hold my hand
oh,
up.
it's taken me a long time.
A lot of the abuse is very subtle. You know,
Yes,
you
there's
did
a
make
level.
you did make a small mistake that
Mhm.
is, put under a microscope and it's enlarged, but it doesn't matter what that person did. A lot of times, a lot of the abuse, the way we feel guilty is because we reacted. There's reactive
We
abuse.
reacted.
And so, and I don't even think that's abuse. I think it's just you react. You get
Natural.
tired of, I can't tell you how many times I asked, you know, for someone to stop doing what they were doing and they didn't stop. And
No,
nobody's helping me get them to stop. I mean, I don't understand why this person can't hear me or understand that I'm telling them to stop. I'm not mincing my words. I'm not elaborating. I'm just saying, could you
right.
please stop doing that? What you just did,
Well, again, as
stop banging
women,
on my door, please. And they'll
setting
continue to do it.
boundaries
Right.
is a difficult because, again,
It's not a matter of setting boundaries because the boundaries are there. And I feel that
no, no, no.
most
What I'm
women have those boundaries.
what
It's
I'm
a matter
saying
of there's
is,
people that don't know how to respect the boundaries.
if
And then we
women,
don't have reinforcement for
right,
people to say, you know what, you crossed her boundary. She told you to stop, you didn't stop. And I'm a person in authority, and obviously she doesn't listen to you, and I'm going to make you listen to me because I have the authority to arrest you. I have authority to put you in jail for 30
but that's
days.
what I was going to
And
say.
that's where we're not finding
We
that
set the
happening.
boundaries, but they're not respected because women have been seen as property. Women's feelings have been dismissed. They're seen as someone
Hysteria.
whose desires
Mm.
for something is greater than their logic for it.
Right.
I mean, so we immediately dismiss what a woman is feeling in lieu of the logic side must be missing because the emotional side is present.
Right. But they don't realize that the emotional side has been totally torn down for
Mhm.
weeks, months, years. And one of the things that I had the hardest time when I was in court. I wanted to scream out to the court. I wanted to say to the judge every time she said something that I didn't like. Well, you're a cunt. What's the matter? You on your period? Because I had female judges, and I wanted to say those things because whenever I was in a disagreement with my husband, that was what was the comeback.
Right.
I would ask, why? I thought you were coming home at 11, not 2 in the morning, drunk. You know, why? You know, I had to be at an early morning meeting this morning. You know, you woke me up. And instead of, and I wanted to walk in court and say those things. But you know what would have happened to me if I had
You've
done that
been
in court?
arrested.
I would have been arrested. Shame,
Yeah.
shame, shame on you. And I would have loved
Right.
to just, you know, I really wanted to walk around and just follow some of the police officers, you know, who told me that because the man who was harassing me when I lived in a common area, and he would, every time I came out, he would say something, he would do something, he would follow me around because he was not hiding in the bushes.
Right.
They could not file a restraining order, and I had to just put up with it. And I wanted to follow them around and do some of the things that he did to me and see what would have they done. They would have
You'd have been
me,
arrested.
and they would have been excited about it. We made our biggest arrest
I've been
today.
arrested.
You know, they would have been
I've
excited.
been arrested for
It would have made
joking.
headlines, you know, and I would have
For
been, I would have to
joking.
go through the test. I would, what, $1,000, $2,000 for an attorney to get me out of this. And the attorney wouldn't have gotten me out of it. They would have told me, oh, you really need to plead to this. You know, you really can't be doing that. Following police officers like that, you know, you can't do that. But if it was to happen to me, they don't care. You just need to put your big girl pants on and deal with it. But they don't like how you deal with it either.
No,
You know,
no.
they don't like that you are reactive to it. It's like you get to a point where it's like, okay,
Never had to be a victim.
if they're not going to arrest him for doing anything to me, so then they're not going to arrest me for doing anything to him, right? No, that's not what happened.
So Victoria, I know you've had, you mentioned you have been arrested. So now I could have been, but I wasn't.
I've been arrested.
I was arrested too.
Yeah, I got arrested.
Most women are.
I was sat here like this, and I was doing a live on Facebook, an informative live, and I was in a bit of a jokey mood, and there was a bang, bang, bang at the door. It turned out to be my postman, but I just, instead of turning the live off, I said, hold on, guys, because my dogs were wagging their tail, so I knew it was someone they knew. So I was like, hold on, guys, there's something at the door. Oh, it might be my rainbow AK-47 that I ordered from Amazon. Now, in the UK, we don't have the same gun laws, so you cannot order a gun. It's totally illegal online, okay? And number one, Amazon or Asda are not two places that you can buy firearms from the UK. So if anyone in the States is wondering, oh, can you get them from there? No, you definitely can't. So when I then went, and I'll show you, the box was no bigger than this deck of cards here. It was tiny. So definitely now I know what a rainbow AK-47 is. Definitely not the size of a rainbow AK-47.
Right.
And I've also found out that unicorn rainbow AK-47s don't actually exist. And on the day of the accusation, apparently I held up a doctor's surgery on a Sunday when the doctor's surgery is closed. So all these little things I had to investigate myself whilst being locked in a cell going, I thought that they were strippers when they came because they were quite good looking police officers. I just couldn't see the Velcro on the back of their trousers because I thought this is so unreal.
I thought so too when I was arrested too.
I thought they were strippers. So I sat down. They were like, can you stand up, please? I was like, what's the name?
No, I thought that when I was arrested, I thought it was a joke. I'm like, you're joking. I'm waiting for, you know, okay, we're going to bail you out of jail. You have to.
You've been punked.
You have to give $1,000 to charity. You know, that's what I thought was happening to me when I was arrested because, gee, he violated the restraining order 6 times and you never arrested. He came and picked the sliding glass door off my back door and put it to the side.
I've got
and I'm calling the police and he's down the street, but he's no longer a threat to you, ma'am. So we're not going to arrest him, even though you have a restraining order. And just go ahead and use it as toilet paper. It's not really worth much of anything.
My own situation, I never slept with the individual that I was involved with because I wanted to wait. Well, little did I know that waiting was not going to preclude, again, the piece of paper that could lie still, because one of the first things he did after the EPO was granted was file sexual abuse charges against me. And it's like,
right.
I'm like, sexual abuse charges against the individual you never slept with? Explain, you know, it's like with narcissism, you really cannot make this shit up. I mean, you're like, how in the world is this possible? And it took the police a few months. And of course, you know, nothing came of it. But it's like, he more than proved who he was what he does and how he operates after the fact. But Gina, you haven't had a chance to tell us about your nonprofit. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about Sweet Corner Girl?
Well,
Then I'm going to talk about mine. So there.
Well, I started Sweet Corner Girl because I really felt there was a need, because there was no funding for women who were seeking to leave or who have left. All of the funding went for research, and that's really what has been the course for the past 30 years. Just until recently was there some transfer of funds, but it seems like there's a lot of money for training and for research, but there's still doesn't seem to be any money for women to actually leave, which is, by the way, the most dangerous time for a woman is when she leaves or when she has left. That is the most time that she's going to be stalked. She's going to be stalked 84% of the time. And the National Institute of Justice still believes that women are the biggest target. It's a very small percentage of men who are victims of domestic violence. It's one of the things that just makes me laugh, and not really laugh, cry, is the fact that the laws in our country were developed for men. Women were property, and the laws that were developed for women about domestic violence were developed for women. And it's unfortunate that we have had to, acquiesce to men being a part of these laws that, were designed for women, because they had laws, stalking laws and everything else for men. So having these laws that were significant for women, because we were and are still perpetrated against. We are, I'm a woman. I'm sorry. I do not have the muscle mass that a man does. I will admit it. I mean, it's biologically, we are not the same. We are absolutely not the same biologically. And, I do, I don't know if I could, protect myself 100% by an attack of a man. I mean, I'd like to think that, the self-defense classes I've taken in the past have, helped me. But, when you are really faced with that,
and if it's someone you love, then often, and if it's the father of your children, you don't want to hurt them.
Right.
This is something else that victims settle very difficultly with. And I find a lot of services say, why didn't you protect yourself better? Why didn't you hit them back to get out? Because we almost then blame the victim for being weak or for being kind.
They had a knife. They threatened you. Your children were in the other room. One of the things that I saw recently was a murder had just been recently solved of a woman who was killed by a man who lived 3 streets away. She went on a date with him, and she decided she didn't want to date him. And her child slept in the other room, and the mother went into her room and said to her, "Do not come out." And it was like her mother knew she was going to be killed. And she laid on the living room floor, and she died. And the one thing that they solved her murder by was that the mother wrote his name in her blood, her own blood. And that's how they solved this murder. And he was a person of suspect that they believed did it, but they had no evidence to prove it back in the 70s, I believe it was. But, that's a lot of the reasons why, women don't fight back. There's so many reasons why we don't fight back.
I served on a jury trial where there had been a history of domestic violence. And until he actually hurt her, there was not follow through. She did not die in the event that brought him to justice. He had been a drinker. A lot of times the domestic violence was dismissed because he was drinking. And so therefore the 6 or 7 times that the police had been called, no report had even been filed, or it had been so buried in paperwork so that by the time he actually came to court for having attacked her with a knife, then they wanted to go back and bring all those to the forefront. And they weren't allowed to. We weren't, so as people who were listening to the case, we weren't allowed to bring forth all of these domestic violence charges that were never basically filed. They didn't even file a lot of the paperwork that even said there was a history of domestic violence. So, when you go into court, the trail isn't there.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
therefore you're looking at two individuals, and like I said, it becomes a he said and she said. And the court system wants to almost like not believe either side, and yet that's how it appears, but then their bias comes in. And that's
Yes.
where, again, because the systems have their own inherent issues systemically, we dismiss it in the system as much as we dismiss it individually. And so, because we've all been permeated by the system and biased by the system to act in certain ways and to believe certain things. So, um, Victoria has family court superheroes, right?
Yeah.
And Gina has Sweet Corner Girl to empower women. And I'm gonna be the shameless plug. Um, I have Love Over Coffee, this podcast, which is going into Real Change. Real Change is the umbrella. And then I have 1111 Messages of Hope from Angels. It's a nonprofit for creating jewelry for survivors.
Oh,
The,
wow.
the the victim, the survivor, designs the jewelry and an angel pays for the piece. And then the angel and the survivor exchange words of encouragement, inspiration, maybe a little bit of their stories with each other. The angel can remain anonymous, the survivor can remain anonymous. There is nothing about the piece of jewelry that screams, I'm a survivor, listen to my story, because the jewelry is supposed to act as a tangible reminder of, as I started the podcast with, who you are, where you've been, and where you're going. And that is something that you share or don't share with circles of friends and or people in groups where you feel safe to do so. If you don't feel safe to do so, then you don't share, or you share a little bit but not all the details. So the jewelry piece is for you to be reminded of the strength behind your own journey. And then I have also just recently branched off into a subscription box called Love Over Coffee, Reclaiming Self. And it is about self care and self love and healing trauma. Because as Victoria pointed out, we often become a victim of the system because we have been a victim of the system, and through our trauma we have not ever healed. And I hate this phrase, hurt people, because I've been a hurt person and I'm not out manipulating the world, but I do
In the
it.
good way. You're the 70%.
Yeah.
And I understand what they mean,
Right.
but it comes back to that, hurt people, so that's an excuse as to why they can and do. And then at the same time, it's that whole idea of, you know because I was traumatized, I'm going to automatically inflict it. As you said, Gina, only 30% of those who have trauma inflicted actually end up inflicting trauma. There's 70% who actually do good things.
Right.
And so when
So
I look at,
one of the points I'd like to make, though, I know you're wrapping up, Tina, but
no, that's
one of the
okay.
points I like to make about that is the fact that they talk so negatively about being a victim of,
Right.
they have those labels, like you're going to grow up to be nobody, you're, because your mother was bad, you're going to be bad. Those are the things that these
Well,
children
there's
are
only two
listening to.
options. You're either going to marry one or become one. That's
Exactly.
that's
And
it. That's all. The
that is
only
such,
two options.
right. And that is what is kind of like weighs heavy on these children and young adults, to hear those things about themselves. That is probably farthest from the truth. I mean, I know I heard that. I heard that more than, but it wasn't what I was telling myself, but I was supposed to believe that in some way. And that's because,
Right.
we do ask for help, and, we do want someone to stop the abuse. And what we do is we often get diagnosed in a pill, and it's like, that doesn't help anything. You take a pill for what you
And
did
why
to
do you
me,
have
and you'll
to?
cure you, and I'll take a pill, and be sedated to you continue to further abuse me, and the system allowing it to happen.
Well,
And that's really what their logic is, which is absolutely no logic at all. And what's scary about this, Tina and Victoria, is the fact that the same people that have been in this system for the past 30, 40 years are the same people that are in the system, and they're not making these changes, even
our
though they
political.
know that these things have gone on for this long, and they don't get it. They're not doing anything to make these changes. And
Yeah.
it's
Proves that
mind-blowing.
more than American politics, because we are looking at 75 and almost 80-year-old white men
Right.
who are still in the political arena, and it boggles my mind that we are still, like I said, we had, I often say we had the most diverse group of candidates, and we ended up with the two old white men running against each other. And it's like, it's picture perfect, says everything, because we see what we want to see. That's why I say all the time, real or, good or bad, right or wrong, real or imagined, my truth is my truth. I don't have to explain to you, I don't have to justify to you. This show is about being exposed to individuals who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't believe like you, who don't live like you. And it's not right or wrong, it's just different.
Right.
We are the ones who put the strange,
Right.
weird, unpleasant label on things.
Mhm.
But really, as much as we all live together, we also live as individuals, and we're all very different from each other. And that's okay. That's not bad. But
Right.
it means that when we come together, we listen to each other and we see the differences and we just accept them. So I don't have an issue with some of the things that are going on in our world, as far as, drag queens and all that kind of stuff. But again, we are distracted by the division. And so instead of worrying about, is the drag queen really more likely to abuse the child? Is the drag queen going into the wrong bathroom really the issue? Or is there something bigger that you want to talk about that you're afraid to talk about?
Well, this in the UK, it's the LGBTQ, and we have a lot of organisations that are gay groups that are saying this is just a divide. All we wanted was that our love wasn't illegal. We got that,
right.
And now a bit like with autism and ADHD, and like you said, bipolar, and all these other trauma label responses that they're giving them, they're now telling children, and that's the problem. For me, I don't believe anyone wearing a thong, because in the UK you've got to be over 18 to watch strippers. So if when I was younger I had a stripper, female stripper or male stripper, gigolo or whatever you call them, or chipmunk, come in doing a magic mic in front of me, depending on age, but I would have been shocked and thought, oh, I didn't think we did this at school. I think that's the only issue. And I think what the government and the world agenda doing is, like you said, they've taken the fact that we go, is that okay around children? Because there's stilettos nearly wiping a toddler's eye. I mean, health and safety wise, just being practical, is that a really good sensible idea? Not that it's a drag queen. I think if a drag queen was to be sensibly dressed and not slut dropping, then it'd be different. But
I mean,
again,
does she look
it's
okay to go to a PTA meeting?
yeah,
You know, is
but
she
it's
dressed
making them hate each
in a
other. It's
business
making
suit? I mean, I can wear a clean dress too, but does she have to wear it to school? Wear a business suit to school. Cover up.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, be appropriate
And
and talk about appropriate issues in front of children.
yes, and I think
Right.
that's the thing is they're just why haven't they got us like on the news talking about being kind and being empaths? Instead they're talking about, oh look, there's these drag queens doing this story hour and that's really good. That's going to have grown men that are homophobic on the streets with pitchforks chasing men who are slightly effeminate, calling them pedophiles, because people have deductive reasoning. And this is the problem, is you've got to be sensible and you've got to go, what is this all about? This is just all rubbish. Because even if the people
Yeah,
that are transitioning say it's rubbish,
it
and
is.
I
Right.
think it's
Right.
inappropriate to talk about
Right.
I think it's inappropriate to talk about your sex life in public. I think it's totally inappropriate.
Whether
let's-
I
you're
never came out
Whether
as heterosexual.
you're heterosexual, I don't want to know what you do after hours. It's none of my business. I did not want to
Here,
know what Clinton did with.
right,
I did not want to know that. It's none of my business.
but here's
It's
the
none of my
issue.
business. And
Is it-
that's his wife's business. That's something that they should deal with on their own. You know, if she wants to go to counseling with him, that's something for themselves, but
But
it's not
here's one
a public
challenge.
debate. It's not my
or
business.
Epstein Island.
As a teacher,
Mm.
I have seen children in the high school that have no idea, because of their family's beliefs, which I understand and support and you know, again, understand that they don't want their child to know. But I've run up against high school students that don't know how you get pregnant, don't know how to prevent pregnancy, don't know about consent, as we talked about earlier. And so, therefore, you've got someone who can very easily prey on that person because that person thinks you can get pregnant by sitting on the toilet seat after a boy has sat down. These kinds of things. And so, therefore,
Well, unfortunately, a lot of parents do not want sex education taught in school.
right. And so that's
are
why.
you going to be the responsible parent and teach your child at home?
Well,
A
see,
lot of
that's
them
the
won't.
thing.
A lot of them won't.
Yeah, exactly.
Teachers are being expected to teach sex ed according to everyone's beliefs, which is impossible.
Exactly.
Okay. It's the same thing when you have the Halloween party and you've got the parents that don't celebrate Halloween and you've got the kids that want to celebrate Halloween and you've got the kids who don't know anything about Halloween and you've got the school system saying you can't talk about Halloween, but then the kids are all coming in talking about what they're going to dress up as for Halloween, and you're like, you want me to keep it out of the classroom? Could you tell me how? Because all of my students are excited about it except for the two kids that don't know anything about it, and they're so confused and I'm not allowed to tell them either. It's like, what do you want me to do? So then you bring that into sex ed, and like I said, you're setting up some children to be vulnerable and to be preyed upon by an individual who says, well, they don't know anything about sex. I'll be happy to teach them.
Exactly.
I'll be happy to figure out how to take advantage of the situation.
And that's how it's done.
Parents don't seem to want to have difficult conversations because it's like they think the TV screen's going to do it for them now.
Exactly.
Like they think they've got YouTube Kids on tap. And also this blind faith in the education system that a teacher, a relative stranger, is going to be able to deal with the emotional issues of them understanding that their daddy's genitalia, their dear darling daddy's genitalia, does that kind of stuff. You know, that emotional impact doesn't. I think the school, the education system, and the families need to have more respect for one another. Absolutely. And I think they need to work together more. But I don't think that's helped by an oppressive government agenda that any parents and any rights they have should be squashed and given to the legal services, the schools, and the health centres, you know, because it diminishes the value of the mothers and the fathers' voices.
Right.
And again, you get that thing where a mother will speak up once and be snapped down look around her, everyone going, shh, be quiet, you doth complain too much, shut up, then they lose their voice, and their children see that. So children then
Right.
become complicit in that kind of turning a blind eye attitude. So
Right.
that's how the abusers often get away with it as well.
Absolutely.
Which is, we have a cyclic problem in the UK at the moment with sentencing, with sexual abusers who work
Well, we do
within
too. I mean,
industries.
we have kids who, we often look at the kid who's acting out and understand that they have issues, but we don't often look at the child who's very quiet. And if we do see a quiet child, their complacency is actually admired, and therefore the acting out child, I mean, because I see it every day in the classroom, the child who's acting out gets all the attention and gets their hand held going down to the principal's office to get a piece of candy to distract them from whatever the issue was in the classroom. And it's like, well, I want out of the classroom, let's do this every day. But then you've got the quiet child who is withdrawn and who acts out in different ways. And, if they are a child that has been, sexually assaulted, then you're asking them to handle a very adult issue in a way in which they don't know how. And then when they speak up about it, it's like, well, are you sure?
New question.
And we're not just talking about young children, but even 14, 15, and 16-year-old children who talk about teachers who cross the line. And and this is where, again, the adult, regardless of their role, should know the line and the boundaries, but we disrespect that boundary and we cross it, and then we still blame the child as though, well, 16
What did you do?
16-year-old boy, who wouldn't want to sleep with their teacher? We ask,
and that is a problem. It's a conquest for a boy,
right,
and,
right.
One of the things about child sexual abuse is, excuse me, is that they're often told that if you tell, they're not going to believe you. If you tell, I'm going to hurt, you're going to hurt your cat, I'm going to hurt something of yours
that you love.
And they often they'll switch around the child. The child should be ashamed of themselves. Those types of perpetrators that gaslight the child, abuse the child. There's so many aspects of it, and a child usually doesn't realize that they've been sexually assaulted as a child until they become an adult, or unless they're caught, unless that perpetrator is caught in the act, which has happened. There's times when it does happen that the perpetrator is caught in the act, and
But I even realized that as an adult woman who has engaged in sexual activity with an individual that I wasn't all that interested in, I realized that we are groomed in such ways to believe things like, well, what you don't do, someone else will.
Yeah.
If you don't do it, they'll find someone else.
Right.
And if it is someone that you like and someone that you've known for a while, and it seems like the next natural progression, and then you sleep with the individual and the whole thing turns on a dime, and you realize that a perpetrator will prey upon you for as long as they need to get you. And whether you're a child, a young adult, or an older individual, they, an abuser, a perpetrator, you are groomed. You are groomed culturally by our society, but you are further groomed as an individual. And sadly, they prey upon the vulnerable, and they will interrogate you in such a way to figure out what your vulnerabilities are, and then they use those to manipulate. So,
and you think they're getting to know you,
right?
But they're actually, you're being interviewed.
You're innocent. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
one of the things that one of the things that I learned, and when you're a victim, you either tell no one or you tell everyone, and then you end up telling no one again. And that's usually because you are blamed. You are,
Shamed.
shamed.
Shame.
Yeah. And it's usually, and you're dismissed,
Right.
you're not taken seriously. And it's the reason why domestic violence is, not reported that often, believe it or not, for the first 6 times. And also, you know, um, there's people who just don't have the experience of taking a report of abuse or assault.
They
You know,
need training.
you
Trauma
think you're
informed.
telling your trusted aunt that uncle so and so played with me, touched me, you know, and that aunt happens to be close to that uncle and adores the uncle because you don't really know the relationship, or you think you're trusted because you know that aunt and they're going to be tell nobody, but then they go and tell the whole family,
I
and
just
then
thought of
that
something.
puts that child into I call it forced isolation. You're ostracized, you're not included.
Well,
You're
and
not
I'm going to
included.
write down what I'm thinking because, it just crossed my mind. Some of us who are truly victims, we're not good victims.
No, that's so true. I'm not a
The
good
only
victim.
good victim is the one playing being a
Yeah.
victim because
Right.
they've
Yes.
got it all figured out. But when you're a victim, a true victim,
You're
it's
blind.
messy and it's dirty and it's ugly and you cry and you don't know who to tell and you don't
Raw.
know what to tell or why to tell or when to tell or
Right.
and somehow the person who is playing the victim, your story is so good and you're like, really? But
Mm-hmm.
being a
Not a
victim
tear.
is dirty. It's
Mhm.
messy.
Shameful. It is
And
shameful because you do feel, how could I have protected myself? How could I let that happen? Why
right.
didn't
That's right.
why didn't I get those creepy feelings from this person to begin with? Why did it
Why
come
did I
so
love them?
late?
That's
Yeah,
what we
why
were
did it
talking
come
about
so late?
earlier. Victoria and I, it's like, I look back now and it's like, why didn't I see what I cannot unsee now?
Right.
But then I have to realize I was manipulated to see a
Mhm.
picture that was being painted that didn't exist. And
Right.
that is very confusing because I want to believe that people are inherently good and
Right.
honest and that what I want is what they want, especially when they say that's what they want. Why would I immediately say,
Yeah.
let me watch you longer? But
Mhm.
having come from now where I have been, I try not to be jaded, but at the same time, my little brain is going, time will tell.
Mhm.
Let's see. Let's
You
see if
know,
your actions back
The
up your
truth will
words.
always out. That's what I say. The
Right.
truth
you
will
know
always
something
out.
too,
It's like the
Tina.
floor.
When we do go to people in authority, like we talked about, law enforcement, you know, teachers or whomever, we do think that they have that higher knowledge, that they know what to do,
Right.
that they are going to take those appropriate steps to stop it. And when it doesn't happen, or when you're dismissed, or there's lack of evidence or some bogus, you know, excuse as to why
Right.
you don't get any justice from it. You there's a sense of being re-traumatized at that point, and that's where that begins. And then you regret that you told that, because it,
Right.
it opens up a whole host of problems that you didn't expect, that you're almost like, I should have just kept my mouth shut and just should have just trudged on and not said a word, because this is not what I anticipated was going to happen. I anticipated that they were going to investigate, number one,
Mm.
at least investigate,
Right.
and don't talk to all of his best friends,
Mm.
Don't,
Truth becomes self-harm, doesn't it? Almost like the more that
Exactly.
you say to save yourself, the worse it becomes for you, because it's more
Right.
spears that get twisted on you, almost like.
Right.
But this happened. But when did it happen? And what frame of mind were you in? And how much had you had to drink? Had you been drinking? Are you always this heightened when
And
you're
why
talking?
did
Do
you
you
go
always
to his
talk this stuff?
apartment when
One of
you know?
the coined phrases for a lot of women who do the reporting is that she's irrational, over emotional. I mean, it's like there's
Talks
like
too
four of them.
fast.
I can't remember all four of them, but there's four of them. Over
Yeah, talks
emotional,
too fast.
rational,
I've had. She's
unreasonable. What else?
Yeah,
What's the
unreasonable,
other one?
talks too fast. She keeps crying,
Yeah,
which means that I think that
yeah,
she's got emotional
yeah,
dysregulation. I think she might
exactly.
be mad.
She's got,
That's
she's got a
yeah.
mental disorder because, all women do, right?
Yeah, of course, because we're
Because
crazy.
women are more likely to be the ones to go seek help. So we're the ones that are most likely to get a diagnosis where,
True.
psychopaths and sociopaths, they don't seek help. So they're never going to be
There's nothing wrong with
stopped.
them. They don't need
Right.
to. They're
They're good at
amazing.
manipulation. So
Well, we are coming up on an hour and a half. I do
Yeah,
want to get to a point where think about your last sip of coffee as we end this conversation.
I've got it here.
You have some final thoughts. So all of us have a nonprofit. All of us are doing what we can to work within the system to change the system. And at the same time, the challenges of that dynamic. Um, what are some of your closing thoughts? And while you're doing that, while you're thinking of your final thoughts, one more time, um, Love Over Coffee. This is a subscription box. I only have 5 boxes left for May, June. I'm only doing 20 subscribers. This box is focused on self love, self care, and healing trauma because once you have been a victim, you realize that in order to survive and to thrive, that while you don't own the abuse, you own your healing.
Too true.
And owning your healing um, is another whole road to walk. And it is not an easy road to walk to realize that you have patterns of behavior that made you vulnerable. So, as much as you do not own the abuse of the individual who perpetrated against you, you must own becoming a survivor and a thriver, an overcomer, and being healed from the trauma. And, the box has knowledge, um, items, and activities to foster some of that. And some of it begins with taking time each day to pour from not an empty cup. So, with that in mind, if it is something you're interested in, let me know. If it's not something you're interested in, it's not your cup of tea, that's okay. It's because I'm your cup of coffee, then that's okay. But I want to put that out there. Like I said, there are only 5 boxes left for May, June, and just message me privately. I have a link tree in my bio on TikTok and on Facebook and on Instagram. So it has about the subscription box. It has about the podcast. It has about all of this stuff. We just got a major message here. It says, "Oh my God, this is what's happening to me with my granddaughter. I've been brought to court for trying to protect her now. I'm a felon at 74 with so many health issues. I was a victim as a child, so I saw what was happening to her."
So sorry to hear that. So
And I
sorry.
don't
Glad you
know.
managed to intercept and break those cycles, though. That takes power.
So I don't know where this individual is tuning in from, but we appreciate your presence as we wind down. So, final thoughts, Victoria.
Well, I say, drawing on what you've just said about self-care, is that tell yourself every single day that you love yourself, you are wanted, and you are lovable. The system isn't going to tell you that. Sometimes the people that were closest to you, that you thought were going to be there in your trauma, aren't going to tell you that. So you have to become a warrior, a superhero, as we call them, and pay it forward. If karmically your actions are good, you know, and you will know with inside yourself, if your actions are good, if your words are good, then you have nothing to fear. And everything else, I have a very healthy place called the fuck it bucket, which I like to put everything else.
I love it.
And
Oh,
I
want
highly
one.
recommend it.
You
This
said
is
So
why I love
everyone,
Victoria. This is why we bonded, because that's her favorite word, and it's mine too.
and just remember to use it at times of woe or despair, and screaming at the moon. If we're lunatics, then
Screaming at
act
the
like
moon.
one. Act like one with pride. You know, if you've been given a label, wear it. Now I wear lots of my labels with hilarity, and I think that's the best
Right.
thing. Smile through it. Definitely
I
Right.
love
helps
that.
with
I love
Absolutely.
that, Victoria. That was so beautiful.
Absolutely. And that's a little bit behind again the 1111 jewelry, is because when you can own your trauma and also not use it to inflict trauma against everyone else, you have come a long way, baby.
Right.
And no, there is no truth out there that's going to overshine my truth,
Yeah.
because like I said to Gina the other day, I got one story. How come the narcissist got 25?
Right.
Yes.
It's like, if you really want to know the story, listen to me, and then listen to the individual who's got a different story every time they talk. And it's like, at what point do you realize that the story changes based on who's listening and what they could possibly do for them, as opposed to, I got one story and you go. I used to say, if you think you got a leg to stand on, baby, be a flamingo. Otherwise, you're just a dodo bird. Go ahead. I mean, it's
Oh my
like,
goodness.
whatever. But bucket, I'm using TikTok. Don't turn me in.
All right. Well,
As you
I'm going
know.
to turn to a little bit more of a serious note here, because that's where
That's
I
okay.
take my stuff, right? But I just want I put a couple of these up. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that?
94% of women know their killers, as do police. Something. Courts, friends, and family. End domestic abuse.
Yeah,
At the first
totally
sign.
agree. Totally agree.
So here, this is some of the research that was done. Can you see this one as well?
You might have to read that one to me.
Okay. To reduce female homicides, prosecutors must give priority to females. This also reduces the number of deaths of children, family, law enforcement, and suicide of abusers. And that's from the National Institute of Justice in 2009, when they did a comprehensive domestic violence on real cases in our court systems. And there's not been much change. And so I think that, when we spend millions of dollars on research and training, there needs to be a time when we start using the research that we have spent millions of dollars throughout our country, because every state is given so much money to fight these, domestic violence, suicides, law enforcement. When we do this research, we need to start implementing policies and start using some of the practical senses that were, extracted from these researches. And so I'm not sure why they haven't been implemented, but from what my research has found, and I conclude, is that more investigation needs to be done on domestic abuse. And I'm talking about the minor instances that we experience. So it doesn't inflate to the physical abuse that ends up ultimately happening in all domestic violence, because it starts emotionally, psychologically, mentally, financially, socially. Those are major ways that domestic violence starts.
Control.
And when we start identifying those in the early stages and getting help for the perpetrator, I know they say they can't be cured and nobody's looking for a cure, but if we can at least
Reflection.
right, get them to say, you're
Right.
not in trouble yet, and we're not gonna make her wait until she has physical injuries before we do something about it. And buddy, we suggest you get some counseling.
Here's a mirror. Yeah.
Here,
And
yeah,
Gina,
you need some counseling.
I'm
And
one of those women that I equated abuse with physical violence.
Mhm.
And
and everybody else does too.
and
If
there
you're
was
not physically
no
abused, then you're not
physical
experiencing
component
domestic violence.
to my situation. It was all mental, emotional, financial, social, and intellectual. And I now realize, just recently, I've realized though that indirectly there was physical and sexual abuse because I've dealt with being overweight all my life.
Mhm.
So the fact that my perpetrator slept with everyone else and not me when I was the one who wanted to wait, it impacted my self-esteem and my confidence because I would try to have conversations about it. And of course, he would gaslight and manipulate. And the same thing with the physical. I realized that physically, headaches and things like that do come on physically, even when there has been no physical violence. So I think we need to definitely make sure people understand abuse is anytime someone has control
Well,
over
abuse
your
is about
body.
control.
Mhm.
Domestic violence is about control. That is the number one
Right.
Of anything. Yeah.
goal. That's the number one
And it starts out small.
method of operation. It's subtle. It's very
Yeah,
subtle.
it starts out
And
small.
other people don't see it like you do see it. They
Right.
don't see it. But I wanted to say, as a last thought, is that domestic violence or domestic abuse is learned behavior.
Right.
Oftentimes when I was in class for criminal justice, we were asked to write about. We were asked to watch, Silence of the Lambs. We were asked to read about Jeffrey Dahmer. We were asked to read about Ted Bundy. They are not. They're in a class of their own.
They're an extreme example.
And something, that's what I would write. I would say that you cannot compare them to a normal household that's dealing with normal problems, or it's not normal, but it's like domestic violence is totally separate from somebody who is as deep of a perpetrator as Ted Bundy or Jeff Dahmer. That is a psychosis that
True.
is on a different level and has nothing to do with how you were raised or anything else. Domestic, violence is a learned behavior. It's passed down from generation. It's passed down from generations of a patriarchal society too. And we need to teach our young boys and our women that, although we are, we do fight for equality, there is an equity that women have, that we are different from men and we have different needs than men do. And there needs to be more of a protective aspect that needs to be taught, and I'm not talking about, it has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with manners. It has to do with preserving our way of life,
Right.
as human beings. Do we really, is it really okay to abuse a woman who is, and I'm not going to say the weaker sex. I don't want to say that, because we are strong in so many ways. And I'm sure there's some women that can take out a man in one punch. I mean, I'm sure I could, I know I could possibly, they won't see that coming though. But if I was defending my life and I had to, I probably would, and I probably could. But I just don't, we do not have the physical capabilities. Oftentimes, we're pregnant, there's so many factors that, women that are at the ages of the highest victimization are those ages when she is in a more vulnerable situation where she is maybe pregnant or just had a child. Those are the times. And so we really need to teach the value of, of women and human, human life, really.
That's the thing. It comes down to humanity, which
Correct.
includes both men and women.
Right.
But we also know that statistically, women are more likely to be a victim of domestic abuse, and
more likely to be murdered through domestic abuse globally as well. So a man can be attacked, hit, or stalked, but statistically, none of those three factors lead to his death. Whereas women can be encountering domestic abuse for the first time and risk death. And that's a scary fact that globally we like you say about not saying about weaker, but we do have to address the fact that the vulnerable, I think this is something we do have to factor children into it now. The vulnerable are the focus of the perpetrator, whether that's male or female. You can take gender out of it, because I know that some men are probably screaming, going, "I'm domestically abused too." Absolutely, a narc's a narc, but it's understanding.
Oftentimes he's one of the 70% of a child who witnessed his mother possibly being abused, or his father sometimes, it does happen.
It's a cycle.
Well, Victoria, number one, I know it's not 11 o'clock in the UK.
I know. I'm thinking I need to go to sleep because I've got to wake up.
Victoria's eyes are getting bigger as she tries to hold them open like an owl, because I know that it is going on 4 o'clock in the morning over there.
Quarter to four. People in meetings tomorrow are going to love me, aren't they? I'm going to be there.
I'm so glad. Do you need one of my coffee boxes?
Yeah, send it over. Send it over one of your pods.
But I want to say thank you. I'm glad it worked out tonight. I'm glad that we are all together. And God works in mysterious ways, higher powers, whatever you want to say, the universe, energy. And so perhaps we had a better conversation tonight with all three of us rather than
and with internet really helps the whole situation.
So thank you.
Thank you. God
I
bless
want
you
to say thank you to those on TikTok. Hopefully I haven't been reported because we had some conversation and some language that I know.
Whack it. It was a whack it.
TikTok's got some issues, I know sometimes. And but I haven't seen TikTok guidelines. Have you ever been on TikTok and TikTok guidelines comes in the chat? You're like, but that's because something got typed, some word got typed and TikTok guidelines come in. Like a robot. It's a robot, but it's picking up on the language. But I want to say thank you to both of you, Victoria in the UK and Gina in the US.
Thank you, Tina.
So
thank you, Tina,
so much making it happen.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Appreciate you.
I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to end my live on TikTok first. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Amy. All right, and now I am going to end the broadcast over here. So thank you, everyone. Carolyn, someone will reach out to you in Messenger. And if nothing else, we can maybe find some resources for what you are going through, especially as an older American, or wherever you might be tuning in from.
Let us know if you're in the UK, if I can help.
Reach out to Three Corner Girl.
Yeah, being a felon at 74, that's a lot. It's a lot to absorb.
Where is the sensibility of our court system at that juncture? They throw
back to the bread. Back to the bread. Why did you steal the bread?
Which is the number one case that I recall as to why they changed the juvenile laws when children there was no juvenile laws back in the day.
So Gina, she says she's in Massachusetts.
Oh, that's great. I'm right next door to you.
Okay. All
So
right.
tell her to reach out to me.
Okay. All right. Gina, thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Victoria.
Gina.
Let me end the podcast for a moment. We're going offline now. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
I
you.
am still confirming a guest for next week, but I know that I have a guest for the 30th, and we will also be doing a special podcast on June 1st, which is World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day, and we will have a long lineup of individuals because the podcast, believe it or not, will be 2 years old June 1st. So
Oh,
Wonderful.
that's hard to believe.
Congratulations.
I remember how scared I was to do episode 1, and now we're 2 years, 2 years later. So, thank you, everyone, and good night. And we'll see you next Tuesday at 9.
Good night.
and
Gina.
see
Thank
you
you
then.
so much.